Imagine driving down a highway that stretches endlessly into the desert horizon. The sun is setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and crimson. You are young, you are free, and the whole world feels like it belongs to you. Now imagine that road becoming the last thing you ever see. That is exactly what happened to 19-year-old Michelle Torres on July 14, 1980. She left her home in Phoenix with a backpack, $47, and a dream of reaching California. She never arrived. For 43 years, her family waited. For 43 years, they wondered. And then, just 6 months ago, a phone call changed everything. What I am about to tell you is not just a cold case story. It is a story about patience, about evil hiding in plain sight, and about how the truth, no matter how long it takes, always finds a way to surface. If you have ever wondered whether justice is real, whether the universe keeps score, stay with me. Because this story will restore your faith in ways you never expected. But before I continue, I need you to do something. If you are watching this and you have ever felt the pain of not knowing what happened to someone you love, share this video. Share it because somewhere out there, another family is waiting for their answers, and maybe this story will inspire someone to come forward. Subscribe to this channel if you believe that every victim deserves to have their story told. Now, let us go back to where it all began. Michelle Torres was the youngest of 4 children, born to Maria and Roberto Torres in a small house on the east side of Phoenix. Her father worked at a copper mine, leaving before dawn and returning after sunset, his hands rough and his back bent from years of labor. Her mother cleaned houses for wealthy families in Scottsdale, often bringing home stories of chandeliers and swimming pools that seemed like fairy tales to young Michelle. Despite their modest means, the Torres household was rich in love. Michelle's older brothers, Carlos and Diego, were protective of their baby sister, teaching her how to throw a punch and how to change a tire. Her sister Elena was her confidant, the one who stayed up late whispering secrets in the bedroom they shared. Michelle was different from the rest of her family in one distinct way. She dreamed big. While her siblings were content to stay in Phoenix, to work the same jobs their parents worked, Michelle talked about Hollywood, about becoming a makeup artist for the movies, about seeing the ocean. She collected magazine clippings of celebrities and practiced doing Elena's makeup until her sister looked like she belonged on a red carpet. By the time Michelle graduated high school in 1979, she had saved enough money working at a local diner to buy herself a used Polaroid camera. She documented everything: her family, her neighborhood, the sunsets that blazed across the Arizona sky. The summer of 1980 was supposed to be her great adventure. She had connected with a friend of a friend in Los Angeles who said she could crash on their couch while she looked for work. The plan was simple: hitchhike to California, save money on bus fare, and start her new life. Her mother begged her to take the bus, to wait until she had more money, but Michelle was impatient. Youth has a way of making us feel invincible, as if tragedy is something that only happens to other people. On the morning of July 14th, Michelle hugged each member of her family goodbye. She promised to call when she reached Los Angeles. She promised to send money home once she got settled. She promised she would make them proud. Roberto Torres drove his daughter to the edge of Interstate 10, where hitchhikers commonly stood with their thumbs out, hoping for a ride west. He remembers the last thing she said to him: "Don't worry, Papa. I'm going to be a star." He watched her walk toward the highway, her backpack bouncing against her shoulders, her dark hair catching the morning light. That was the last time anyone in the Torres family saw Michelle alive. The first few days of silence were not alarming. The family assumed Michelle was on the road, that she would call once she arrived. But by July 20th, 6 days after her departure, Maria Torres knew something was wrong. A mother always knows. She called the Los Angeles friend, who said Michelle had never arrived. She called the Phoenix police, who told her to wait, that young women often ran off and returned on their own. But Michelle did not run off. Michelle was responsible, despite her dreams and her youth. She would never have let her family worry like this. By August, the Torres family had plastered missing person flyers across Phoenix. Roberto drove the entire route to Los Angeles twice, stopping at every gas station, every diner, every motel, showing Michelle's photograph to anyone who would look. No one remembered her. It was as if she had vanished into the desert heat, evaporated like morning dew on hot asphalt. The police officially listed her as a missing person but dedicated minimal resources to the case. In 1980, young women who hitchhiked were often blamed for their own disappearances. The prevailing attitude was one of judgment rather than urgency. The Torres family refused to give up. Carlos and Diego spent their weekends searching the desert, looking for any sign of their sister. Elena organized community searches, rallying neighbors and friends to help comb the vast Arizona wilderness. Maria lit a candle every night by Michelle's photograph, praying to every saint she knew. But the years passed with no answers. The flyers faded and tore in the wind. The community's attention shifted to other tragedies. Eventually, even the police stopped returning the family's calls. What nobody knew then, what nobody could have known, was that the answer to Michelle's disappearance was hiding in plain sight all along. The man who took her lived less than 15 miles from the Torres home. He attended community events, went to church on Sundays, and raised a family of his own. For 43 years, he kept his secret buried, literally and figuratively. He watched as the Torres family suffered, as Maria Torres died in 2015, still not knowing what happened to her daughter. He lived his life without consequence, without guilt, without remorse, until science and fate conspired to expose him. Time is supposed to heal all wounds, but whoever said that never experienced the particular agony of not knowing. For the Torres family, each passing year was not a step toward healing, but a step deeper into a unique form of torture. Hope became both their salvation and their prison. They could not move on because moving on meant accepting that Michelle was never coming back, and accepting that meant betraying her memory. Carlos Torres, Michelle's oldest brother, became consumed by the search for his sister. He was 24 years old when she disappeared, newly married, with a baby on the way. His wife, Linda, tried to be understanding at first, but as months turned into years, the obsession began to erode their marriage. Carlos spent every spare moment researching missing persons cases, writing letters to police departments, contacting journalists who might be interested in Michelle's story. He kept a filing cabinet in the garage filled with documents, tips, and dead ends. His son, Michael, named after his lost aunt, grew up knowing that his father's heart was divided between the family he had and the sister he lost. Diego Torres dealt with the grief differently. He turned inward, becoming quiet and withdrawn where he had once been outgoing and quick to laugh. He started drinking heavily in his 30s, trying to numb the constant ache of wondering. What if Michelle was still alive somewhere, held captive, waiting for rescue? What if she was dead and alone in the desert, her bones scattered by animals? The not knowing was worse than any confirmed tragedy could ever be. Diego's drinking cost him 2 marriages and nearly cost him his relationship with his children. He would later describe those decades as living in a gray haze, where nothing felt real and nothing felt worth celebrating. Elena Torres became the family's emotional anchor, though she struggled with her own demons. She had been the closest to Michelle, the one who knew her sister's secrets and dreams. The guilt of not stopping Michelle from hitchhiking, of not insisting she take the bus, haunted Elena for decades. She became a social worker, dedicating her life to helping at-risk youth, channeling her grief into service. But at night, when the work was done and the house was quiet, she would take out the Polaroids Michelle had left behind and weep for the life her sister never got to live. Maria and Roberto Torres never recovered from losing their youngest child. Roberto continued working at the mine until his body gave out, then spent his retirement years writing letters to anyone he thought might help: politicians, celebrities, true crime authors. He kept a detailed journal of every lead, every theory, every disappointment. When he died in 2007 of a heart attack, the family found pages and pages of unsent letters, each one a desperate plea for information about Michelle. Maria outlived her husband by 8 years, but those who knew her said she died long before her body gave out. The light in her eyes extinguished the day Michelle disappeared and never returned. The Torres family became fixtures at missing persons events and cold case conferences. They connected with other families who understood their pain, forming a community of the perpetually grieving. They pushed for legislation to improve the handling of missing persons cases, testified before state committees, and kept Michelle's name in the public consciousness however they could. Every 5 years on the anniversary of her disappearance, they held a memorial service, inviting anyone who would come to remember a young woman who dreamed of Hollywood and never got there. The turning point came in 2018 when Carlos's son, Michael Torres, now an adult with children of his own, decided to submit his DNA to a genealogical database. The popularity of these databases had exploded in recent years, with millions of people uploading their genetic information in hopes of connecting with long-lost relatives or learning about their ancestry. Michael's motivation was simpler. He wanted to feel closer to the aunt he never knew, to see if perhaps some distant cousin might have information the family did not. What Michael did not know was that investigators across the country had begun using these same databases to solve cold cases. Through a technique called genetic genealogy, they could match DNA evidence from crime scenes to distant relatives of the perpetrator, then use traditional genealogical research to identify the suspect. It was this technique that would ultimately crack Michelle's case wide open. In 2021, a hiker exploring a remote area of the Sonoran desert stumbled upon something that would change everything. The area was known for its rugged beauty, its towering saguaro cacti, and dramatic rock formations. It was not known for human remains. But there, partially exposed by decades of erosion, was a collection of bones that would soon be identified as belonging to Michelle Torres. Let me pause here and ask you something. Think about your own family for a moment. Think about the people you love most in this world. If one of them vanished without a trace, how far would you go to find answers? Would you spend decades searching? Would you sacrifice your own peace of mind, your relationships, your health? Leave a comment below and tell me what you think you would do. I believe our response to this question reveals something profound about who we are and what we value. The discovery of Michelle's remains was both an ending and a beginning. For the Torres family, it meant finally knowing that Michelle was dead, that she had not run away to start a new life, that she had not chosen to abandon them. That knowledge, as devastating as it was, brought a strange kind of relief. The torture of not knowing was over, but it also meant the beginning of a new chapter, the quest for justice. Someone had killed Michelle Torres and left her body in the desert to rot. Somewhere, that person was still walking free. When Detective Sarah Mendez received the call about the remains found in the Sonoran Desert, she had been with the Phoenix Police Department's cold case unit for 7 years. She had seen her share of tragedy, of cases gone cold, of families destroyed by unanswered questions. But something about the Torres case immediately captured her attention. Maybe it was the decades of dedicated advocacy by the family. Maybe it was the poignancy of a young woman on the cusp of her dreams, struck down before she could reach them. Whatever the reason, Detective Mendez made solving Michelle Torres's murder her personal mission. The first step was confirming the identity of the remains. Despite 43 years of exposure to the elements, the bones were remarkably well preserved, protected by the dry desert climate and a partial burial that had shielded them from scavengers. A forensic anthropologist determined that the remains belonged to a female between 18 and 25 years old, approximately 5 feet 4 inches tall, consistent with Michelle's description. But the conclusive proof came from DNA. Michael Torres's submission to the genealogical database had created a genetic reference point. The remains were compared to his DNA, and the match confirmed what the family had feared and hoped for in equal measure. Michelle Torres had been found. Detective Mendez visited the Torres family personally to deliver the news. Carlos, now in his 60s, wept openly when she told him. Diego, sober for 5 years after a near-fatal accident, sat in stunned silence. Elena clutched her sister's Polaroid camera, the one Michelle had left behind, as if holding it could somehow bridge the gap between life and death. The family had waited 43 years for this moment, and now that it had arrived, they were not sure how to feel. Grief and relief, anger and gratitude, all swirled together in an emotional storm that threatened to overwhelm them. But Detective Mendez was not just there to deliver news of the identification. She was there to make a promise. She looked each member of the Torres family in the eyes and told them that she would find out who did this. She would bring Michelle's killer to justice, no matter how long it took, no matter how many dead ends she encountered. It was a promise she intended to keep. The investigation began with the crime scene. Detective Mendez and her team spent weeks at the location where Michelle's remains were found, carefully excavating the area, documenting every piece of evidence. What they discovered painted a disturbing picture. Michelle had been buried in a shallow grave, her body positioned as if the killer had been in a hurry. Near the remains, they found fragments of fabric that matched the description of the clothes Michelle was wearing when she disappeared. They found the rusted remnants of a belt buckle. And most importantly, they found teeth, several of which contained fillings that could be matched to dental records and DNA that did not belong to Michelle. The significance of this discovery cannot be overstated. In 1980, DNA technology did not exist in any practical form for criminal investigations. Evidence that seemed useless at the time could now be analyzed with precision that would have seemed like science fiction to investigators of that era. The DNA from the dental evidence belonged to a male, someone who had been present at Michelle's burial, someone who had left biological evidence at the scene. All Detective Mendez needed to do was figure out who that person was. She started with the genealogical databases. The same technology that had helped identify Michelle could potentially identify her killer. The DNA from the crime scene was uploaded to multiple databases, and investigators waited for a match. The process of genetic genealogy is painstaking and complex. Even a match does not immediately identify a suspect. Instead, it identifies relatives, often distant cousins, and investigators must then build a family tree to narrow down the potential candidates. Months passed with no results. Detective Mendez refused to be discouraged. She reviewed every piece of evidence from the original 1980 investigation, such as it was. She read Roberto Torres's journal, noting the leads he had pursued and the dead ends he had encountered. She interviewed the aging friends and acquaintances who remembered Michelle, hoping someone might remember something they had not thought was important at the time. One name kept appearing in the old case files, a name that made Detective Mendez's blood run cold. Howard Clement. In 1980, Howard Clement was a 32-year-old truck driver who frequently traveled the route between Phoenix and Los Angeles. He had been questioned during the initial investigation because he was known to pick up hitchhikers. He had alibis for the day Michelle disappeared, corroborated by his wife, and he was never seriously considered a suspect. But Detective Mendez noticed something that the original investigators had missed or ignored. 3 other young women had disappeared along the same route between 1978 and 1982. All of them were hitchhiking. All of them were never found. Howard Clement was the kind of man who blended into the background of any community. He was not particularly handsome or particularly ugly. He was not especially charming or notably awkward. He was, by all outward appearances, utterly ordinary. Born in Flagstaff in 1948, he was raised by a single mother who worked as a waitress at a roadside diner. His father left when Howard was 2 years old and never made contact again. Howard was an average student, an average athlete, an average everything. He graduated high school in 1966 and immediately went to work, first at a gas station, then as a long-haul trucker. He married young, to a woman named Barbara who he met at a church social in 1969. Barbara was quiet and deferential, the kind of woman who made her husband's lunch every morning and never questioned where he went or what he did. They had 2 children together, a son named Howard Jr. and a daughter named Rebecca. To the outside world, the Clement family was unremarkable in every way. They attended First Baptist Church every Sunday, contributed to neighborhood potlucks, and kept their lawn neatly trimmed. But beneath this facade of normalcy, something dark was lurking. Detective Mendez began digging into Howard Clement's history, looking for any sign of the monster she suspected him to be. What she found was troubling. In 1975, a young woman in California had filed a police report claiming that Howard Clement had picked her up while she was hitchhiking and made inappropriate advances. She managed to escape when he stopped for gas, and the case was never prosecuted. The report had been buried in a filing cabinet for nearly 50 years, forgotten until Detective Mendez unearthed it. There were other incidents too. A complaint from a coworker in 1973 who said Howard made her uncomfortable, that he stared at her in ways that felt predatory. An arrest in 1968 for peeping into windows, charges that were dropped when Howard agreed to leave the town where the incident occurred. Each incident on its own seemed minor, the kind of thing that might be explained away as misunderstanding or youthful indiscretion. But together, they painted a portrait of a man with dark impulses he struggled to control. Detective Mendez needed more than suspicion, though. She needed evidence. The genealogical DNA search had finally produced a result, a match to a second cousin of Howard Clement. Working with genetic genealogists, investigators built a family tree that led directly to Howard. He was now 75 years old, living in a retirement community just outside Phoenix. His wife Barbara had died in 2019, and his children lived out of state. He was alone, aging, and presumably confident that whatever secrets he held would die with him. Getting a DNA sample from Howard without alerting him to the investigation required careful planning. Detective Mendez had seen too many cases fall apart because suspects were tipped off and destroyed evidence. She worked with the district attorney's office to develop a strategy. Officers surveilled Howard for weeks, waiting for an opportunity to collect discarded DNA. Finally, they got their chance. Howard went to dinner at a local restaurant, and after he left, officers collected the glass he had been drinking from. The lab results came back within a week. The DNA from Howard Clement's drinking glass was a match to the DNA found at Michelle Torres's burial site. After 43 years, they had their killer. But Detective Mendez was not satisfied with just one charge. She suspected Howard Clement of being responsible for the disappearances of multiple young women, and she was determined to find evidence of his other crimes. With the DNA match providing probable cause, she obtained a search warrant for Howard's home. What they found in that unassuming house in that quiet retirement community would haunt everyone involved in the investigation for the rest of their lives. In the garage, hidden behind a false wall that Howard had apparently constructed himself, was a collection of items that no innocent man would possess. Driver's licenses, jewelry, photographs. Each item represented a young woman who had crossed paths with Howard Clement at the worst possible moment. There were 17 items in total, suggesting that Howard's crimes extended far beyond what anyone had imagined. Among the items was a Polaroid camera. Not just any camera, but the camera that Michelle Torres had been so proud of, the one her family assumed she had taken with her to California. Inside the camera was a roll of film that had never been developed. The morning of Howard Clement's arrest was cool and clear, the kind of Arizona winter day that seems to promise renewal and hope. Detective Mendez had barely slept the night before, running through every detail of the case in her mind, preparing for any eventuality. At 6:47 a.m., she knocked on the door of Howard Clement's modest home, backed by a team of officers who had been briefed on the suspect's potential dangerousness. Howard opened the door wearing a bathrobe and slippers, looking every bit the harmless elderly retiree. His hair was white and thinning, his hands spotted with age, his posture slightly stooped. He looked at the assembled officers with an expression of mild confusion, as if he could not possibly imagine why they would be at his door. Detective Mendez would later describe that moment as one of the most surreal of her career. Here was a man who had likely murdered nearly 20 young women over the course of a decade, and he looked like someone's grandfather, the kind of man who would give you hard candy and tell you stories about the old days. Howard Clement, Detective Mendez said, "You are under arrest for the murder of Michelle Torres in July 1980. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." Howard's expression did not change. He did not protest his innocence or demand to know what was happening. He simply nodded, as if he had been expecting this moment for 43 years and was almost relieved that it had finally arrived. He turned around without being asked, placing his wrists behind his back for the handcuffs. As he was led to the police car, Neighbors began emerging from their homes, watching in shock as the quiet old man from down the street was loaded into the back of a cruiser. The news of Howard's arrest spread through the community like wildfire. This was not some anonymous stranger from far away. This was someone they knew. Someone who had waved to them from his driveway. Someone who had attended community meetings and contributed to charity drives. The cognitive dissonance was overwhelming. How could someone who seemed so normal, so benign, be capable of such monstrous acts? For the Torres family, the arrest brought a complex mixture of emotions. Carlos called his sister Elena the moment he heard the news, his voice breaking as he tried to articulate what he was feeling. Vindication, certainly, after decades of being told that Michelle had probably run off, that she was probably living somewhere under a new name, that they should accept her disappearance and move on. Grief, renewed and sharpened by the confirmation of what they had always feared. And anger, a deep, burning anger at the man who had stolen their sister, their daughter, their family's heart. Elena immediately began making calls, reaching out to the families of other young women who had disappeared along the I-10 corridor in the late 70s and early 80s. She knew instinctively that Michelle was not Howard's only victim, and she felt a responsibility to help other families find the closure that had been denied to them for so long. Within days, she had connected with 7 families who had missing loved ones that fit the profile. The Polaroid camera found in Howard's hidden room was sent to a forensic lab for analysis. The roll of film inside had degraded significantly over the decades, but modern restoration techniques were able to recover most of the images. What they revealed was devastating. The photographs showed Michelle Torres in the passenger seat of a truck, smiling at the camera, clearly unaware of the fate that awaited her. There were pictures of the desert landscape, of the sun setting over the mountains, of the highway stretching endlessly ahead. And there was one final photograph, blurry and partially corrupted, that showed a figure lying on the ground, unmoving. Detective Mendez had seen many disturbing things in her career, but these photographs hit different. They captured the last moments of a young woman's life, her joy and hope giving way to unimaginable horror. They were evidence of unspeakable cruelty, but they were also a testimony to Michelle's humanity, to the life she had been living before it was stolen from her. Howard Clement was charged with first-degree murder in the death of Michelle Torres. But investigators were far from finished. Working with the evidence from his hidden room, they began the painstaking process of identifying each item, of connecting it to a victim, of building cases that had been cold for decades. Within months, Howard was facing charges in 4 additional murders, with more expected as the investigation continued. The trial of Howard Clement began on a Tuesday in September, 18 months after his arrest. The courtroom was packed with spectators, including members of the Torres family who had waited more than 4 decades for this moment. Carlos sat in the front row, flanked by his sister Elena and his son Michael. Diego had wanted to come, but was recovering from a health scare that his doctors attributed to decades of stress and grief. He watched the proceedings via a video link from his hospital bed. The prosecution's case was overwhelming. DNA evidence placed Howard at the scene of Michelle's burial. The items found in his hidden room connected him to multiple victims. The photographs on Michelle's camera documented her final hours. And then there was Howard himself, who had waived his right to remain silent and given a full confession to Detective Mendez. The confession was played in the courtroom, and the effect was devastating. Howard spoke in a flat, emotionless voice, describing how he had picked up Michelle on the morning of July 14, 1980. He said she was friendly and trusting, eager to talk about her dreams of Hollywood. He said he drove for several hours, making small talk, before pulling off the highway onto a remote desert road. What happened next was described in clinical detail that made several jurors visibly ill. Howard expressed no remorse. When asked why he had committed these crimes, he shrugged and said he could not help himself, that there was something inside him that needed to be fed. He showed no understanding of the suffering he had caused, no recognition of his victims as human beings with families who loved them. He was, in the words of a forensic psychiatrist who testified at trial, a textbook psychopath, someone entirely devoid of empathy or conscience. The defense attorney, a public defender named Michael Reeves, faced an impossible task. There was no disputing the evidence, no alternative explanation to offer. Instead, Reeves focused on Howard's age and health, arguing that a life sentence for a 76-year-old man was effectively a death sentence and pleading for mercy. But mercy was in short supply in that courtroom. The jurors had seen the photographs. They had heard the confession. They had looked into the faces of the families whose loved ones had been taken. After 3 weeks of testimony, the jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Howard Clement was convicted of 5 counts of first-degree murder, with investigators continuing to work on additional cases. The judge, in sentencing Howard to 5 consecutive life terms without the possibility of parole, made a statement that resonated with everyone in the courtroom. "Mr. Clement," the judge said, "you have lived your entire adult life as a free man while your victims' families suffered the torment of not knowing. You have enjoyed decades of freedom that you denied to the young women whose lives you stole. You have shown no remorse, no understanding of the magnitude of your crimes. It is the judgment of this court that you will spend whatever years remain to you behind bars, contemplating the evil you have done. May God have mercy on your soul, because this court has none to offer." Elena Torres was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. She approached the podium slowly, carrying Michelle's Polaroid camera in her hands. She looked at Howard Clement, who sat impassively at the defense table, and began to speak. "My sister Michelle was 19 years old when you took her from us. She was full of life, full of dreams, full of love. She wanted to be a makeup artist in Hollywood. She wanted to see the ocean. She wanted to make our parents proud. You took all of that from her. You took 43 years from our family. Our mother died not knowing what happened to her daughter. Our father spent his retirement writing letters that never got answered. My brothers have struggled with addiction and depression. I have spent my career trying to help other families because I could not help my own. All because of you." Elena's voice broke, but she steadied herself and continued. "But you did not win, Howard. You thought you got away with it. You thought your secret would die with you. But Michelle's story has been told. Her name has been spoken, and you will spend the rest of your days in a cage, while Michelle's memory lives on in everyone who hears this story. You did not win. We did." The conviction of Howard Clement sent shockwaves through the true crime community and beyond. Here was a case that demonstrated both the limitations of 1980s law enforcement and the potential of modern forensic technology. Genetic genealogy, the technique that had ultimately cracked the case, became the subject of intense public interest, with families of missing persons across the country hoping that similar breakthroughs might bring answers to their own cases. For the Torres family, the aftermath of the trial was a time of profound transition. For 43 years, their lives had been defined by Michelle's disappearance, by the search for answers, by the hope that someday they would know the truth. Now they knew, and they had to figure out how to live in a world where the question that had consumed them for so long had finally been answered. Carlos Torres, who had spent decades neglecting his marriage and his children in pursuit of his sister's killer, began the slow work of rebuilding his relationships. His wife Linda, who had stayed with him through everything, told reporters that she felt like she was meeting a new version of her husband, someone who could finally be present because he was not constantly looking backward. Carlos started attending therapy, working through the complicated grief that had defined his adult life. He began writing a memoir about his family's journey, hoping that it might help other families facing similar situations. Diego Torres left the hospital and returned home, where his children and grandchildren surrounded him with love. The resolution of Michelle's case seemed to lift a weight that he had carried for decades. He stopped drinking entirely, telling his family that he finally felt like he deserved to live a good life. He started volunteering with a grief support group, using his experience to help others navigate the impossible landscape of ambiguous loss. Elena Torres continued her work as a social worker, but expanded her advocacy efforts. She founded an organization called Michelle's Light, dedicated to supporting families of missing persons and advocating for improved law enforcement practices. The organization connected families with resources, provided grants for private investigators, and lobbied for legislation requiring better tracking of missing persons cases. Within 2 years, Michelle's light had helped dozens of families find answers about their missing loved ones. The other families connected to Howard Clement's crimes also found a measure of closure. 3 more victims were positively identified through DNA evidence and the items found in Howard's hidden room. Their families, some of whom had spent decades in the same limbo the Torres family knew so well, finally learned what happened to their daughters, sisters, and mothers. They joined together in a support group facilitated by Elena, finding comfort in shared grief and shared survival. Detective Sarah Mendez received numerous accolades for her work on the case, but she always deflected credit to the Torres family. They never gave up, she said in interviews. For 43 years, they kept Michelle's name alive. They kept pushing for answers. They kept believing that justice was possible. I just did my job. They did something much harder. They kept hoping when hope seemed impossible. The case also prompted a re-examination of how law enforcement handles missing persons cases. In Arizona, new legislation required police departments to begin investigations immediately when young women were reported missing, eliminating the waiting periods that had delayed the initial search for Michelle. Similar reforms were adopted in states across the country, a legacy that Michelle Torres would never have imagined when she set out on that July morning with dreams of Hollywood in her heart. Howard Clement was transferred to a maximum security prison, where he would spend the rest of his days. True crime podcasters and documentary makers clamored for interviews, but he refused all requests. The man who had hidden in plain sight for decades seemed to have no interest in publicity now that his crimes had been exposed. Prison officials reported that he spent his days in solitary confinement, showing no interest in interacting with other inmates or participating in prison programs. Just think about that for a moment. Howard Clement existed in the same community as the Torres family for over 40 years. He watched Maria Torres die without knowing what happened to her daughter. He watched as the family held annual memorials, as they pleaded for information on television, as they slowly deteriorated under the weight of not knowing. And he said nothing. He kept his secret, lived his comfortable life, and probably assumed he would die without ever facing consequences. But he was wrong. Science caught up with him. Persistence caught up with him. Justice, delayed by decades, finally arrived. And now, instead of dying peacefully in his own bed surrounded by whatever family remained to him, he will die in a cell, remembered forever as a monster. On the 1-year anniversary of Howard Clement's conviction, the Torres family gathered at a small cemetery on the outskirts of Phoenix. Michelle's remains had finally been released to the family after the trial concluded, and they were about to lay her to rest beside her parents. The ceremony was private, just family and a few close friends, but the emotions were anything but small. Carlos stood at the graveside, wearing a suit that had grown loose on his aging frame. He looked at the simple headstone that bore his sister's name, her birth date, and the date of her death, finally confirmed after 4 decades of uncertainty. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a photograph, one of the Polaroids Michelle had taken before she left, showing the whole family gathered on the porch of their childhood home. He placed the photograph on the casket, his hand trembling slightly. "We found you, little sister," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "We never stopped looking. Mama and Papa, they are waiting for you. You are not alone anymore." Elena stood beside him, clutching a bouquet of sunflowers, Michelle's favorite. She had prepared remarks, written and rewritten them a dozen times, but in the moment, the words seemed inadequate. Instead, she simply said, "I love you, Michelle. I always have. I always will. Rest now." Diego, still recovering from his health scare but determined to be present, sat in a wheelchair nearby. He did not speak, but tears streamed down his weathered face. His children stood behind him, their hands on his shoulders, a physical reminder that despite everything, he was not alone. Michael Torres, the nephew who had never known his aunt but had helped solve her murder through his DNA submission, read a poem he had written for the occasion. It spoke of legacy and memory, of how the dead live on in the lives of those who remember them. It spoke of Michelle's dreams of Hollywood, never realized but now immortalized in a story that millions would hear. It spoke of justice delayed but not denied, of evil exposed and defeated. After the ceremony, the family gathered at Carlos's home for a meal. The atmosphere was different from the somber gatherings they had held for so many years. There was grief, certainly, but there was also something that had been absent for decades. There was peace. There was closure. There was the beginning of healing. Elena raised a glass of wine and proposed a toast. To Michelle, she said, who dreamed big and loved hard and deserved so much better than she got. To our parents, who never stopped hoping. To all of us, who never stopped fighting. And to the future, where we honor Michelle's memory by living the lives she would have wanted us to live. Full of joy, full of purpose, full of love. The family drank together, and for the first time in 43 years, the weight of the unknown had lifted. They knew what happened to Michelle. They knew who was responsible. They knew that justice had been served. And they knew that Michelle's story, though it had ended in tragedy, had ultimately become a testament to the power of love, persistence, and hope. In the weeks that followed, something remarkable happened. The story of Michelle Torres and the arrest of Howard Clement reached millions of people through news coverage, documentaries, and social media. And those millions of people began reaching out to their own loved ones, reconnecting with family members they had lost touch with, telling people they cared about how much they meant to them. Michelle's death, senseless and cruel as it was, had sparked a ripple effect of love and connection that spread far beyond Arizona, far beyond the true crime community, into the lives of strangers who heard her story and were moved to action. A young woman in Ohio saw the documentary about Michelle and decided to call her estranged mother for the first time in 5 years. A father in Texas who had given up hope of finding his runaway daughter was inspired to reopen the search, ultimately finding her alive and working in a shelter for homeless youth. A cold case detective in Florida who had been considering retirement decided to stay on the job, using genealogy to solve 3 additional cases in the following year. Michelle Torres never made it to Hollywood. She never became a makeup artist to the stars. She never saw the ocean. But her legacy, the legacy of her family's refusal to give up, the legacy of justice finally served, the legacy of a story that moved millions, that legacy will endure for generations. And somewhere, perhaps, Michelle is finally at peace, reunited with her parents, watching over her siblings and their children and their children's children, knowing that she was loved, knowing that she was never forgotten, knowing that in the end, love won. The desert highway where Michelle Torres began her final journey still stretches endlessly toward the California horizon. Every day, travelers drive that road, oblivious to the history beneath their wheels. But for those who know the story, the road has taken on a different meaning. It is no longer just a path to somewhere else. It is a reminder that evil exists in this world, but so does justice. It is a reminder that some families never stop searching. It is a reminder that the truth, no matter how long it takes, will eventually find its way into the light. Michelle Torres deserved better than she got. But in the end, her family made sure that her story was told, her killer was caught, and her memory was honored. That is as close to a happy ending as this tragedy could ever have. And it is a testament to the power of love to triumph over even the darkest evil. The Torres family still gathers every year on July 14th, the anniversary of Michelle's disappearance. But now the gatherings are different. Instead of searching for answers, they celebrate Michelle's life. They share stories and look at photographs and laugh about the mischief she used to get into as a child. They light candles and say prayers and remember that she existed, that she mattered, that she was loved. And every year, Elena Torres ends the gathering with the same words: Michelle is home now. And so are we.